Disclaimer. Before we start, this episode mixes observable facts with interpretive analysis. I'm going to show you specific policies, dates, and documented effects. That's data. Then I'm going to tell you what I think that means, what pattern I'm seeing, and why it concerns me. That's opinion. I'm going to be clear about which is which. You should know what you're getting into. Hello, friend. I got a notification the other day. One of those news alerts that just sits there in your phone until you decide whether you want to read it or stick it in the mental "I'll deal with that later" pile. It was about the 1776 Commission getting revived, and I realized something. I'd been sitting here in 2025 watching policy after policy come down the pipe, and I hadn't actually lined them up next to each other. Like, individually, they could make sense to people who support them. Each one has its own possible justification. Each one sounds reasonable if you already agree with the premise. But I kept thinking, there's something happening together here that I need to actually look at. So I did. And what I found concerns me. Not because of any one policy, because of what they add up to when you stop looking at them separately. Let me start with the facts. These are observable, documented policies implemented between January and March 2025. DEI elimination in January 2025. President Trump signed Executive Order 14151. It's called Ending Radical and Wasteful Government DEI Programs and Preferencing. What does this order actually do? Well, it eliminates diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives across every federal agency. Every one. It prohibits federal funding for DEI training. It goes after universities, the ones with billion-dollar endowments specifically, and threatens them with audits and lawsuits if they have diversity programs. 4 days later, another order. Ending illegal discrimination and restoring merit-based opportunity. This one revokes Executive Order 11246. That executive order has been in place since 1965. Lyndon Johnson signed it. It required federal contractors to make affirmative efforts to hire people of color. 60 years of policy. Gone. That's observable. That happened. Those are the orders. Education and historical narratives. The 1776 Commission gets reinstated. It came out in Trump's first term with a report that minimized the role of slavery in American history and dismissed the 1619 Project as divisive. The new executive order, 14190, is called Ending Radical Indoctrination in K-12 Schooling. It reinstates the 1776 Commission to teach what they call patriotic education. What does that look like in practice? The Department of Defense removes profiles of Black Medal of Honor recipients from their websites, not because they're inaccurate, not because there's a question about their service. They're gone because it doesn't fit the patriotic narrative that they're pushing. Again, this is observable. These things are documented and happening. The global gag rule is expanded and reinstated. Internationally, any NGO that receives U.S. funding can't provide abortion services or even refer people for abortion. The scope gets expanded to all global health assistance, HIV/AIDS programs, maternal health, pandemic preparedness. Domestically, they're defunding Title X providers, Planned Parenthood, and other clinics that provide contraception and abortion referrals. There's movement toward criminalization of abortion providers in multiple states with federal encouragement. This is documented. This is happening. This is observable. LGBTQ policy, Project 2025, the policy blueprint this administration seems to be following, calls for removing sexual orientation and gender identity from federal regulations, defining gender strictly by sex assigned at birth, ending transgender health care in Medicare and Medicaid, banning transgender military service, eliminating workplace anti-discrimination rules based on sexual orientation or gender identity. In schools, students can't use names or pronouns different from their birth certificates. Schools that implement LGBTQ inclusive curriculum face penalties. Research shows that respecting a transgender person's chosen name and pronouns reduces suicide risk by 50%. These policies have a documented cost, and yet they're being implemented anyway. This is all documented. This is what's happening. These aren't rumors or speculation. These are executive orders, policy changes, and documented actions. Now, here's where I switch from facts to interpretation. This is where I tell you what I think this means. So let me line these up for you. Programs designed to address racial discrimination in hiring, eliminated. Historical narratives that center racial injustice in American history, removed from education. Reproductive autonomy, especially for low-income women and women of color, restricted. LGBTQ rights and recognition, systematically erased. Each policy individually could be defended on its own terms. I get that. If you already believe government shouldn't mandate diversity, the DEI elimination makes sense to you. If you already believe abortion is morally wrong, the restrictions make sense. If you already believe gender is determined by biology alone, the LGBTQ policies make sense. But here's what I'm seeing. When you line them up, every single one of these policies disproportionately affects people who are not straight white men. Every single one. And here's what really gets me. We've been arguing for years about what "Make America Great Again" actually means. What era? What version of America? What does great look like? Well, they're showing us right now with policy. And it turns out great has a very specific demographic profile. Because here's what I think is actually happening. And I'm going to say this directly. I think an administration made up predominantly of old straight white men is trying to recreate what they perceive as the good old days, the era when the deck was stacked in their favor. Not because they're cartoon villains sitting in a room plotting oppression, but because that's the world they remember fondly. That's the world where they had the power, where they felt comfortable, where the rules made sense to them, and they want it back. And you know what? They finally tipped their hand. They've shown us what great again actually means. Let me be specific about what I mean by the good old days. The 1940s and 50s, that particular era. And here's what that era looked like. White men overwhelmingly dominated institutions. Women were pushed out of the workforce and into domestic roles. Reproductive choices for women were extremely limited. LGBTQ identity was criminalized and socially erased. History taught in schools centered white accomplishment and minimized racial injustice. Now look at the policy cluster I just described. Elimination of equity initiatives that help people of color access employment. Removal of critical racial narratives from education. reproductive restrictions that limit women's autonomy, LGBTQ erasure from federal policy, patriotic education that centers on specific version of American greatness. That's not a coincidence. That's not random ideological alignment. That's a roadmap back to a specific era, an era where one demographic had structural advantages and everyone else had structural disadvantages. They've been saying "Make America Great Again" for years, and we've all been arguing about what that means. Well, now they're showing us. And it turns out, great looks a lot like 1950. Now, I can already hear some of you saying, "Dave, you're reading too much into this. These are separate policies with separate justifications." And you know what? Maybe. Maybe I'm connecting dots that aren't meant to be connected. Maybe this is all just ideological alignment that happens to recreate the power structure of the 1950s. But here's my question. At what point does the function matter more than the intent? At what point do we stop asking, did they mean to do this, and start asking, what does it mean that this is what's happening? Because whether it's coordinated or not, whether it's deliberate or just convenient, this functions as a coherent system that advantages one group while disadvantaging others. And when a pattern is this clear across this many policy domains, the question isn't whether someone designed it. The question is whether we're comfortable with what it's creating. Here's the test I want you to think about. And I'm genuinely asking you to think about it, not just react. If I describe this cluster of policies without naming who implemented them, if I just said, a government is implementing policies that systematically reduce rights and recognition for 3 demographic groups while expanding relative advantage for a 4th, and that government was one you disagreed with, would you be concerned? Let me flip it. Imagine a progressive administration implemented policies that systematically restricted the rights of religious Americans, removed Christian historical narratives from schools, restricted fertility treatments for traditional families, and eliminated workplace protections for socially conservative workers. Would that concern you? Would that feel like systematic erosion of a specific group's rights and recognition? I think it would. I think reasonable people across both sides of the aisle would find that pattern concerning. Not because any one policy is necessarily wrong, but because the pattern creates a system where one group loses ground while another gains it. And here's what's actually concerning me most. It's not even the policies themselves, it's the normalization. We normalize things incrementally, one policy at a time. One executive order, one curriculum standard, one defunding, and then suddenly it's not shocking anymore. It's just the background. It's just how things are. Democracies don't usually break through dramatic coups. They break through normalization, through enough small decisions that move what's considered acceptable. And what I'm watching is a cluster of policies that, if they all hold, if they all get normalized, creates an institutional environment where one demographic has systemically more power, more recognition, more autonomy, while others have less. And we're already past the shock. We're already into the acceptance. When the DEI orders came out, there was noise. When the 1776 Commission was reinstated, there were articles. When the reproductive restrictions expanded, there were protests. But each one gets normalized. Each one becomes just another policy decision. Each one gets filed away as, well, that's what they believe, instead of, wait, what does this look like when you add them all together? Look, I'm going to be honest about what I don't know. I don't know if there's a master plan. I don't know if someone sat in a room and said, let's systemically restore the power structure of the 1950s. I genuinely don't know if this is that coordinated. But I also don't know that it matters. Because here's what I do know. The administration is predominantly old, straight, white men. The policies being implemented systematically advantage people who look like them. The era being referenced implicitly and explicitly is one where people who look like them had overwhelming structural advantage. And they call this making America great again. So maybe the question isn't whether they sat down and planned to recreate the 1950s. Maybe the question is, what did they think was so great about that era? And who was it great for? Because here's the thing that really gets me. The slogan has always been, make America great again. Not make America fair again. Not make America equal again. Not make America inclusive again. Great. Great for whom? Great compared to what? Great by what measure? Well, now we know. We have the receipts. We have the policy record. We know what great looks like in practice. It looks like 1950, when white men dominated, when women's choices were limited, when LGBTQ people were invisible, when history was told from one perspective, when the deck was stacked in favor of one group. That's what great means. They've shown us. And you know what the most frustrating part is? They're not even hiding it. They're doing this openly with executive orders, with policy announcements, with public justifications. The 1776 Commission isn't called Let's Minimize Slavery. It's called Patriotic Education. The DEI elimination isn't called Let's Stop Helping People of Color. It's called Restoring Merit-Based Opportunity. The LGBTQ erasure isn't called Making Queer People Invisible. It's called Biological Reality. But the function is the same. The effect is coherent. The pattern is clear. And the question I keep coming back to is, why are we pretending we don't see it? Between January and March 2025, a cluster of policies came down. DEI was eliminated. Affirmative action revoked. Historical narratives about race removed from education. Reproductive rights were restricted. LGBTQ identity erased from federal policy. That's facts. These things happened. They're documented. They're observable. My interpretation. They tell a story about what great again actually means. My concern? We're normalizing it. So here's my actual question I'm genuinely asking. Would you accept this cluster of policies from the other side? Not one policy, the whole package. Not from this administration, but from someone you already disagreed with. If the answer is no, if you'd be genuinely concerned about what the pattern, if someone else did it, then maybe the question isn't whether this is intentional. Maybe the question is why we're okay with it now. Because they've shown us what great means. It means an era where the deck was stacked in favor of one group. And they're rebuilding that deck right now, one policy at a time. What are we building here by accepting this? What precedent does this set? When did we decide this was the version of America worth restoring? That's all I got for you this week. Thanks for sticking with me. Now get off my lawn.